Hey guys, welcome back to 90 Feet From Home. I'm your host Ashley, and today we are going to talk about the World Series. Now when you watch this, it's most likely going to be that the World Series is already over and either the Houston Astros or Washington Nationals will have won if you're watching in 2019. If you're watching further on down the road, there will obviously be different contenders for that title, but the basic rules and history of the game will stay the same. Now it has been quite some time since I recorded, and I'm really hoping I still have the hang of this. I had a lot of issues happening here, both with flooding and with a big blizzard, and lots of things keeping me from being able to record. So I had really hoped to get this World Series episode out before the World Series started, but I am going to record this. It is currently the Saturday of the 25th. It's currently Saturday, October 26th as I film this, so I'm really hoping to be able to get it out while the World Series is still happening. As of right now, Game 4 is scheduled to go on tonight, and yeah, it's gonna be very interesting to see if I can get this out before somebody actually wins it. So in previous episodes, we kind of discussed how the different parts of the postseason work, from the wild card to the division series to the championship series. And so what all that leads to is, of course, the World Series. Now the World Series is kind of a misnomer if you think about it, because most of the teams in Major League Baseball are in the United States, with the exception of the Toronto Blue Jays. So calling it a World Series is kind of a misnomer, because it is really just the best of the American and Canadian teams. So a North American series, perhaps? Of course, there is the World Baseball Classic, which is a more true representation of the best teams in the world, but a lot of the players on those particular teams are also American, so it is kind of hard to pinpoint an actual World Series. And in later videos, we'll talk about stuff like the World Baseball Classic, and we'll also discuss baseball in other countries, because it's huge in places like Japan, Australia, Korea, China. So there is a big contingent of actual world teams that do not participate in the World Series. So don't let the name kind of fool you. It is more truly a North American best of, or if we're really being honest, it's really just who's the best in Major League Baseball. But World Series is what it's called. So a more appropriate title is what it's sometimes referred to, which is the Fall Classic. So that is because, of course, it takes place at the end of October, though in previous years and way earlier in the sport, when there were fewer rounds of the postseason and fewer regular season games, it did happen sometimes late September, early October, but now it does usually tend to wrap up right around Halloween every year. And what it is, of course, is a best of 7 series between the best team in the American League and the best team in the National League, as determined through those 3 previous rounds of play. And I'll put that video for the postseason rounds up, so if you're not sure exactly how those games are played, you can kind of get a refresher on that. And then the World Series, of course, is a best of 7 between the winners of those 3 first previous rounds. Now, whoever wins the World Series does not take home a World Series trophy. What they win is actually referred to as the Commissioner's Trophy. And this commissioner they're referring to is the Commissioner of Baseball. The Commissioner of Baseball kind of sets out the rules and guidelines and helps determine how the sport is played, creates new rules, new kind of events. So the commissioner would be the one who decides how many wildcard teams there are, just how we get to 2 wildcard teams in each of the leagues. And those are sort of examples of some things that the commissioner can do. So the current Commissioner of Baseball as of 2019 is Rob Manfred. So the Commissioner's Trophy is kind of the ultimate award from the Commissioner's office to be the best team in Major League Baseball. And I'm gonna throw up a picture here so you can kind of get an idea of what the Commissioner's Trophy looks like. So all of the flags, there are 30 of them, represent each of the 30 teams in Major League Baseball, both in the National and American leagues. It weighs about 30 pounds and is composed of sterling silver, and each of those 30 flags is gold-plated. In the base of it, there's actually a baseball input within, which is covered in longitude and latitude lines meant to symbolize the world, you know, World Series. And the base does contain an inscription of the commissioner's signature and the words presented by the Commissioner of Baseball. So the original trophy was designed in 1967 by Balfour Jewelers and was worth about $2,500. In 1999, it was actually redesigned by Tiffany & Company, and that Tiffany redesign is the version that we see today. So now I bet when you thought you clicked on this World Series video, you did not think you were gonna get a full history of the Commissioner's Trophy, but I am thorough, you guys. So we're gonna talk about that damn trophy and you're gonna learn all about it. So the World Series originally started in 1903, and the Earlier versions of the World Series, until 1969, it was just automatically whichever of the teams was best in each of the leagues would automatically advance to the World Series, and whoever won that best of 7 series was considered the World Series champion. So like I said, in early versions of the World Series, it got to be played a lot earlier and ended a lot sooner because we didn't have to go out through round and round and round of finding, which of the teams was the best. And if we'd still used that version from 1903, you wouldn't see a team like the Washington Nationals getting to the World Series because they were actually the wild card winners in the National League this year. And the Los Angeles Dodgers were actually the best team in the National League by wins. So you can see how it kind of changes things up to have those new rules implemented over the years as things kind of advance and you get more teams involved in the postseason. Now, not counting the 2019 World Series because I don't yet know who's going to win it, there have been 114 World Series games played, and of that, the American League has won 66 times, and the National League has won 48 times. Now, prior to 1903, there actually was no postseason, and whichever team ended the season with the best record overall was automatically considered to be the championship team. Between 1884 and 1890, which is during the period in which the American Association appeared, there were actually championship postseason games played between the American Association and the National League, but these weren't exactly organized the same way we see the World Series played today. While they were a postseason series of games to determine a champion, we don't consider them to be officially a World Series the same way we do now. There was no set number of games, and we'd see things between 3 games to 15 games played in these postseason series, so really it wasn't as coordinated or organized as what we're seeing today. Now, between 1893 and 1969, we saw a version of the World Series played, which was just the best teams in each league playing each other to find a champion overall. It was very similar to that precursor version, but it was kind of segued into modern play. Now, there is kind of a brief period where this was changed up a little bit to see kind of more teams introduced into the postseason as a precursor to the variation that we see today. So between 1894 and 1897, league champions would play the runners-up from the season in a series referred to as the Temple Cup. So this is actually a very short-lived kind of period of baseball. We're not going to dive too deep into it, but it does kind of hint that there was a time early on in baseball where they kind of wanted to see a longer and more extended version of postseason play. Now, the first official World Series in 1903 still wasn't exactly the way we see the World Series played today, as it was an exhibition game that was arranged well ahead of time, and it was between the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Boston Americans, which was the American League precursor to the Red Sox. This was actually an 8-game series, and Boston came out the winners of this first official World Series. Now, there's a lot of very interesting World Series history, some of which we'll dive into in their own 10-minute history episodes. One worth noting is the 1919 World Series, which was one of the first times we saw a team actually kind of take a bribe in order to lose a World Series intentionally, or at least to start the process of losing a World Series intentionally. This is often referred to as the Black Sox because it was the Chicago White Sox who took bribes in order to throw that World Series. And we'll dive into that in a whole episode, but it is worth noting that the World Series has been compromised in the past, although betting and gambling regulations circulating around baseball have made that a lot harder to pull off in modern era games. Now, the World Series as we know it now is a very prime time event run on Fox and TBS, and as many of those games are held at night as possible to capture the biggest television audience. But for a very long stretch of time, it was a requirement for the World Series to be played during the day because night games simply didn't exist in the 1930s and prior. It actually wasn't until 1949 that the first ever World Series game was played at night under lights. In fact, there hasn't been a day game in the World Series since 1987 in Minnesota. Now, the history of baseball has also been interesting in the evolution of the designated hitter. The designated hitter was introduced in 1973 to the American League. It wasn't until 1976 that the designated hitter was allowed to appear in the World Series. Now, the rules of this are interesting in that whichever team is playing at their home stadium, the home field or home league rules apply. So when an American League team is playing at a National League stadium in the postseason, including the World Series, they don't get to use a designated hitter. And when the National League team is playing at an American League stadium, they are entitled to adopt a designated hitter. Twitter. So that's an interesting change in the postseason, and that only started coming about in 1976. 1984 was the first record of a manager having won the World Series in both of the leagues, and that went to Sparky Anderson and the 1984 Tigers. He had previously won it with the Cincinnati Reds in both 1975 and 1976. The 1989 World Series is incredibly notable because it was between two Bay Area teams in the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland Athletics. What was more notable about it, however, is that during Game 3, prior to the start of the game itself, the Loma Prieta earthquake occurred. And this was a 7.1 magnitude earthquake, which ultimately killed about 63 people, and the epicenter of the quake was actually quite close to the Bay Area. The game was ultimately delayed about 10 days because, of course, you couldn't play it. It was an incredibly powerful earthquake, and it wasn't until about 30 minutes after the quake that the game was officially moved, and it was ultimately played 10 days later, and the Athletics went on to win that series. 1992 was the first time a non-American team won the World Series, and that was with the Toronto Blue Jays winning back-to-back in 1992 and 1993, and that was my personal introduction to baseball. I was about 9 years old, and I remember those games very, very clearly. There was a lot of excitement in Canada around those, and it kind of built a lot of hype up. And a Canadian team was likely to win in 1994 with the Montreal Expos having one of the best seasons of their franchise history. And unfortunately, the 1994 strike put an end to that, and before the Expos ever got a chance to go back to the World Series, the team was moved out of Canada. I'm very sad. But they may win peripherally if the Washington Nationals go on to win this World Series in 2019, because the Expos did go on to become the Washington Nationals. So 1994 saw the introduction of 3 divisions in each of the leagues, and that restructuring saw the introduction of the League Division Series, which we now see going from League Division Series to League Championship Series to World Series. So you can see that 1994 was a bit of a change up for things. However, it's important to note that even though 1994 saw the introduction of the new divisions, a division series was not played in 1994 because of that aforementioned strike. It wasn't actually until 1995 that we saw the first League Division Series played. 2001 was the first time we ever saw a World Series end in November. That was, of course, related to the September 11th terrorist attacks in New York City, pushing the entire baseball schedule back, and as a result, the World Series was finished in November of that year. 2004 is notable because it was the end of the 86-year drought for the Boston Red Sox having won the World Series, and similarly, 2016 was the end of a whopping 108-year drought for the Chicago Cubs, and they won against the Cleveland Indians in 2016, and it was tremendous. In the 2000s, there was some even-year magic for the San Francisco Giants, who won the World Series in 2010, 2012, and 2014. From 2003 to 2016, home field advantage for the World Series was determined by the winning league of the All-Star Game. Thankfully, after 2013, that reverted back to the old way, and whichever team had the highest win percentage from the regular season, that team's league would then have home field advantage for the World Series. Now let's talk dynasties and which teams have the most wins in World Series history. Of course, the New York Yankees have the most overall with 27 World Series titles, and they have appeared in a whopping 40 World Series over the team's history. The St. Louis Cardinals have 11 World Series wins, and the Boston Red Sox, in spite of that 86-year drought, have 9 World Series titles. Only Major League team to have never appeared in a World Series is the Seattle Mariners, and there are 6 teams currently who have never won a World Series title. The Texas Rangers, the San Diego Padres, the Milwaukee Brewers, the Tampa Bay Rays, the Washington Nationals, and the Colorado Rockies. As I mentioned previously, the American League teams have won 66 of the 114 World Series played to date. So if we factor in the 27 Yankees wins in that total, the Yankees have won almost 24% of all World Series titles and 40% of American League titles overall. I would safely say they can be proud of their claim to have a dynasty of the World Series. Although this year, with them missing the World Series in 2019, it marks the first decade the Yankees have never appeared in a World Series. Well, that's a that's a fun fact unless you're a Yankees fan, and if that's the case, I apologize. The current longest drought now belongs to the Cleveland Indians, who faced off against those previously long-standing droughties, the Chicago Cubs, in 2016. The Cleveland Indians have not won a World Series since 1948. I cannot do the math on that on the top of my head. That is 71 years according to my calculator. Don't ask me to do mental math, you guys. You've seen me try to do magic number calculations, okay? So 71 years. That's a long time for the Cleveland Indians to go without a World Series title. So there you have it, guys. A brief overview of the World Series. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of history, and I hope it gave you more appreciation of what the World Series is all about. So if you liked it, give it a big thumbs up down below. While you're down there, remember to hit that subscribe button and ring that bell if you want to be notified every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday when a new episode goes live. And of course, you can follow me on social media where I'm at 90 Feet From Home on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time, guys, we'll see you again. Have a great one. Bye.